I'm no good at taking good advice, and I'm self-careless, so don't tell me twice that lately I've been so stuck in my head that I forget just about everything my therapist said. Maybe I'm self-helpless, maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe I'm self-helpless. Maybe we are all self-helpless.
Hey everyone, welcome to Self-Helpless. I'm Delanie Fischer, and today I'm chatting with psychotherapists McKenna and Helen Villiers, who specialize in helping people understand narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder and heal from emotional abuse. And our focus today is narcissistic family systems and dynamics. So today's topic was submitted and voted on by our community over at patreon.com/selfhelpless. Thank you for your submissions, and thank you to those who voted both on Patreon and via email. So, we've talked about narcissism and NPD before. A lot of the episodes in the past have included information about romantic relationships where this is happening, but you wanted to dig into this from the angle of having a parent with a personality disorder and how that impacts the entire family, which is exactly what Katie and Helen do. So, it's very cool that we were able to book specialists in the exact niche you wanted. So, if you feel like there's been a lot of heavy guilt tripping and criticism by a parent, and perhaps your other parent is more passive or enabling these behaviors, maybe you feel like no matter what you do, it's never been good enough, or perhaps one sibling in the family seems to get blamed for everything while another sibling can do no wrong, or perhaps there's one sibling that's just ignored completely by the parent. These are just some signs that you might be part of a narcissistic family dynamic. So, Helen and Katie share how you can recognize these things if they've happened to you or are happening to you or in your family, and basically what you can do about it. Just a heads up, they also share there's no one cookie cutter type of way that this shows up in a family. Everyone's situation is different, but they do provide a variety of examples for how something like this can look, and also the damage it can cause, how it can impact your relationships as the adult child of a parent with a disorder like this, and how to heal from it and unlearn unhealthy behaviors that have been exemplified for you. They touch on everything from the different types of categories a parent can fall into, like the critical parent or the engulfing parent, as well as the categories the kids can fall into, like the golden child or the scapegoat. And they give examples for what each of these dynamics can look like in everyday situations. They also shared some new information about borderline personality disorder, the three different types of parentification that exist, and why it can be extremely hard for someone to recognize and accept that they've been in an unhealthy family dynamic. Super fascinating information. Thank you again to our patrons for voting for this topic. And here's Katie and Helen. So, if we could just get started with some of the basics, if this is somebody's first introduction, can you share, what is a personality disorder and how common are they?
Yeah, absolutely. So personality disorders are essentially trauma responses. I mean, there's different theories on how they develop, but really where we come from is the idea that they are as a result of trauma. There might be a genetic influence to it, but that's not proven yet. We don't know what that might be. So really, we're talking about early childhood trauma that is really quite significant. That means that a person has to learn a set of survival coping mechanisms to adapt to the world that they're in to keep themselves safe. And those can be very helpful in childhood, but as a result, be quite difficult in adulthood.
What's the percentage of people who might have a personality disorder?
It's underreported because a lot of people don't go to get assessed. But for narcissistic personality disorder, for example, it's thought to be around 1.5, 1.6% of the population. But again, it's undiagnosed because a lot of people that go for that are people that are either court mandated to go to, because a lot of people that are, again, have narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, don't go to therapy because they don't believe that they have a problem. If you're in a relationship with somebody with NPD, they'll say that, well, if you have a problem, that's a problem, just get over it. And if anything, they go to therapy to prove that they are right and to prove the other person wrong, and they don't engage, they don't stay in therapy. So when held accountable for their behavior, they don't go back.
That makes so much sense. I was going to say that has to be such a hard thing to get accurate data around, because the very nature of the disorder is that they think it's everybody else's problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some common signs that a parent of yours might have a personality disorder? Are there any kind of telltale things that people can be mindful of?
I think it's really important to recognize that there are different personality disorders that manifest really differently. Our specialism is MPD. Both of us will work with people with borderline personality disorder, or EUPD as it's now known. But they're different. There's overlaps. There's different kind of what's called clusters in the DSM-5. So if we narrow down personality disorder to NPD, which is our kind of area of specialism, signs that your parent might have those things, there are 5 main traits that we would look for, which would be grandiosity, the idea that they're better than everyone else, and that might be overt or covert presentation. All of these traits might be overt or covert. So we've got grandiosity, entitlement, we've got exploitation, using people to meet that entitlement need. Then we've got impaired empathy. We call it motivational empathy. It trips people up because there's a kind of misconception that there's a complete lack of empathy. That's true of something like psychopathy, which is now actually antisocial personality disorder, but that's a whole different topic. But psychopathy, and then we've got impaired self-awareness. So again, not that there's a complete lack of it, but just that it's not as deep as one needs it to be for there to be a desire to change behavior. So in a parent, we would be looking at the behavior in terms of how they respond to their child. Are they accepting the child's autonomy? Do they have them rigid in a way that they should behave? Is it all about their image? Do they punish you if you embarrass them? Are they allowing the child to say no to them? Is their love conditional? Are they using emotional abuse to control and dominate their child? And are they weaponizing fear, obligation, and guilt? You know, it's quite big and broad, but those are kind of some of the real basic ones.
I suppose what we do then in You're Not the Problem is that we put these into 4 categories. And what we see is the critical parent. So that's the parent that's not happy with anything and they're not afraid to say it. So they're commenting on every aspect of their child and then their adult child's life, from their hair to their weight to their driving to their parenting to how they're behaving. So they're very critical. Then we see the ignoring parent. They're ignoring of what the child is going on in their life. They won't ask them any questions, how they're doing. A lot of the times they won't even know the job that their child has. So they're very ignoring of their child. And then we would have the engulfing parent, which is the complete opposite of the ignoring parent. That's the parent that's overly involved in every single aspect of their child's life. This is where we see the hovering parent, the engulfing parent. So they're not giving the child any space, any freedom to live their own life. And then we would have the combination parent, which is a combination of all 3. And we would really see that. A lot of people can see that their parent leans more heavily into one category, but they will actually see that they fall into other aspects. So even the engulfing parent can be ignoring because they're not meeting the child's needs. This is all about the parent. So even though they're so involved in every single aspect of the child's life, they're ignoring their no, they're ignoring their boundaries, they're ignoring their wants and preferences. They're, denying their child their autonomy, and they can be critical when the child wants the autonomy. So that's how we would see the combination parent.
What are they afraid of when their kid is trying to become autonomous? What is that hitting in them that kind of triggers this behavior?
The narcissistic parent will take a child's no, a child's strive for autonomy, as a personal rejection. This is where they don't see the child as their own individual, their own autonomous being, their own separate being. This is where they see the child as an extension of themselves. So they take it so personally that if the child is not doing what the parent wants, is not aligned with the parent's beliefs, with the parent's expectations, and they can either respond to that with anger. So overt criticism, or what Helen had mentioned earlier, that's motivational empathy, that if you're doing something that doesn't align with me, the narcissistic parent can use that motivational empathy and say, how could you do this to me? How, how could you betray me? How could you think this way? Did I not raise you right? And blame the child and shame the child for doing something that is well within their own rights. So that is well within their own entitlement. And somebody growing up in this environment will really struggle to have that healthy sense of entitlement, because they will have that shame and have that blame and will have their empathy weaponized against them. So in short, they take this personally.
Very interesting. Could you give us maybe an example for each category that you mentioned, the critical type of parent versus the engulfing, maybe as a kid or as a teenager, whatever you want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not really going to change. It's just probably going to be a different thing that is criticized. So for a child with a critical parent, it'll be your work's not good enough, your room's not tidy enough, you're not tidy enough. Why won't you wear the clothes I think you should wear? And can't you just be a bit more like neighbor Sue's daughter? She's so much better than you. She really cares about what she looks like. And why haven't you brushed your hair? And God, you're so embarrassing. You let us down. You're making me look bad. Right? So there's this constant narrative of you're not good enough all the time. And then if we think about the ignoring parent, it is just that, like, they don't know what's going on with you at school, or personally, they just no interest in you. You're completely invisible to them. But then if we go to the engulfing parent, what that might look like is wanting to know everything about you, wanting to know about your physical things. So especially with girls, it'll be about periods, like when did you last have your period? And is there, being really intrusive and invasive, even about sexual development and asking about sexual contact with partners or boyfriends or girlfriends or whoever. And then also kind of just really far too involved in that, and sort of things like overstepping that space of like, are you masturbating, and do you know this and that, and just being icky and great, that kind of I can't breathe, I'm suffocated. They want to come to every event, so you're like, oh, I'm going to go to the cinema, oh, I'll come with you, well, I'm going with my friend, oh well, yeah, but I can tag along, it won't matter. And just kind of enmeshing themselves into your life, so there's no space or breathing space for the child to grow up in, with kind of that autonomy, that kind of getting separation from the parent. It's very normal, particularly in teenage years, from the age of around 11, 12, for children to want to separate from their parent. And that should actually be encouraged. That independence, that self-reliance should be really encouraged. It's like, yeah, babe, go off and have a great time. Give me a shout when you want picking up, or whatever it is. Now, you do that safely, of course. You're not saying go and go to some random place and I don't know where you are and can't get hold of you, but you're allowing them to explore their independence and their self-reliance, their problem solving, even if something goes wrong, like if they're meant to get a bus home and it doesn't turn up, and that they work out how to manage that. And you help them do that, but you're not doing it for them all the time. And the engulfing parent will do it for them all the time. Whereas the critical parent will be like, oh my God, how did you not fix that? Why didn't you get the bus? Why don't you just wait for the next one? You're so stupid. Why don't you just get a taxi? It would be a constant criticism of that child in a way that is so degrading, demoralizing. And what that then teaches the child is that they can't rely on themselves. And couple all of this with constant gaslighting. I don't like it when you criticize me. Oh my God, you're so oversensitive. You overreact. You've got to be able to hear criticism. I've got to be the one that teaches you. If it's not me, it's going to be someone else. And it's like, why does your first bully have to be your parent? That is not a true thing. Like, we don't need that. Right. We need from our parent to feel completely safe and accepted and loved and allowed to be able to make mistakes and shown how to correct them without shame, judgment, or criticism. And the critical parent obviously just does not do that at all. They really just degrade a child's sense of self and self-reliance.
When we're talking about the parents, the different categories, it's to understand that the impact of this is the same throughout for each of the children. So when we can go into a minute talking about identifying the different roles in the narcissistic family, but somebody being brought up in an environment like this, what we see is that they will either lean more heavily towards hyperdependence or hyperindependence. And hyperdependence is what people might identify before as people pleasing or codependency. And that's that if they can't say no to anyone, or, you know, like they do everything for everyone, they'll also feel really responsible for other people's emotions, and they'll feel anxious and guilty when other people have problems. You know, they'll want to fix it. They'll want to be the rescuer. They will typically have a fear of conflict, and they'll wonder why others don't give the same as they do. So they will overgive, over-elicit, over-listen. And often then that can breed such resentment then in the relationship, and they can struggle when somebody says no to them, because they will feel like, after all I've done for you, they will notice that the level of reciprocity isn't given to them, and they can be exploited heavily. People can use them and treat them like doormats because they're afraid of conflict, afraid of saying no. They also feel like a burden when they're asking for help, and they think that they're less important in the relationship. So if we think of that in like on one end of the spectrum, and then we see over here on the other side, the hyper independence, and they can't say no to the people that they love, and they feel really independent. You know, the hyper independence is really individual, that they consider themselves like on an island, that they have to do everything for themselves. So they will say no to help. They won't ask for help. They will decide everything by themselves. And they really struggle with trust. They'll struggle to trust close friends, even their spouse, because they've had to be so self-reliant from a young age. And they'll be very guarded in relationships. You know, they'll keep people at arm's length, and they're very private about their personal life. They typically will dislike and have a rejection to needy people that will feel really engulfing for them. And just again, to emphasize that they do everything by themselves. So in a workplace, they won't delegate tasks. They can, you know, be very much a workaholic, you know, constantly being busy, do. And they can typically struggle with long-term relationships because they struggle to let others in, they struggle to be intimate, they struggle to be vulnerable. And again, those sound like, and they are on opposite ends, and a lot of people can lean more heavily towards the other, but can recognize themselves in different parts. And because ultimately it's coming from the same wound, that fear of rejection, fear of intimacy, fear of abandonment, you know, ultimately fear of vulnerability and lacking identity, because again, it was denied so heavily, that identity in childhood.
So interesting. So if somebody is becoming hyper independent, is that because they have felt usually like maybe too engulfed by relationships, and they like feel suffocated and they don't want to even deal with anybody's shit ever again? Or like what makes somebody go that way versus the other end?
Hyperdependence.
Yeah, hyperdependence.
Yeah.
Like what makes somebody go one way or the other, if anything?
Well, do you know what's so interesting is I did a TikTok about this a little while ago, that I had this hypothesis that people who had very critical scapegoat, well, the critical parent that then made them what we call the scapegoat child, were more likely to be hyperdependent, because they're trying to get the parent wound healed through their partner, parent, like friends and family, that people around them. And the people who have been very smothered with the engulfing parent, or very enmeshed, a gilded child is something that we also know. And those would more likely be hyper independent. Now, when I put this on TikTok, I asked the question, and actually that didn't seem to track. But obviously I'd want to do more inquiry, because I think sometimes people see themselves as one, but actually if we were to really look at it, they probably are the other. But they don't understand where their self-awareness might not be as robust as we would want to be, which is natural, given you have to disconnect when you grow up in these environments just to protect yourself. So your self-awareness is going to be lower, just until you start really therapy essentially, and learning and building that self-awareness. Yeah,
I would imagine like the hyperdependence would potentially happen. Like, yeah, if the parent really was, I don't know, doing a lot for you, or wanted to be part of every little detail of your life, that you maybe didn't develop certain skills to have independence as you get older. Or how does that
well,
work?
I think it's actually the other way around. So I think it's hyperdependence comes from emotional abandonment, ignoring, and hypercritical parent, and hyper independence comes from being smothered and suffocated and engulfed and wanting space to breathe. And that any time you're in relationship with someone, as Katie was saying about how hyper-independence can find what they might term needy people as really off-putting, because for them it feels smothering. And what that then would mean for them is surrendering their entire identity to meet the needs of the engulfing person, which is what would have happened in childhood, you see.
Okay. And so let's say that somebody wants to get in a relationship and that other person is kind of a healthy amount of emotionally available. They're not actually needy, but the child of, somebody with NPD is perceiving them as needy. Does that happen?
Well, when we're talking about this kind of neediness, and when I was describing that kind of in the hyper-independence, when somebody is hyper-independent, even a healthy amount of neediness, because it is healthy to have needs.
Right.
One of the things that growing up in these dynamics is that the adult will really struggle to identify what they need in the moment. And this is where they can capitulate and people please, or even reject people. Whereas actually the thing what the hyper-independent might need is connection, is a healthy amount of interdependence, where I can lean on you and you can lean on me. Right. Whereas by the very fact that they're saying, I have to manage everything all by myself, that is not what we are wired for. We are wired for connection. We are wired for community. We aren't supposed to do all this by ourselves. So that is highlighting, obviously, the trauma that had happened in them in childhood. So it's really important that what the hyper-independent would be naming as needy. You're absolutely right. That could be a normal amount of needs. That could be somebody saying to them, I want you to be emotionally available. I want you to share with me. I want you to be vulnerable with me. I want you to be emotionally present with me. I want to be able to, and for them to say, I want to be able to rely on you. I want to be able to lean on you and have this reciprocity in the relationship. And yes, for somebody that is really high end on the hyper-independent scale, that could be too much for them, which is why they would struggle in long-term relationships, because in long-term relationships and as relationships develop, that's typically where we would want to see the emotional intimacy grow, the connection deepening, the trust deepening, whereas the hyper-independent will really struggle with that trust because they will be scared to get hurt and disappointed. So they will, that it's easier just not to go through that. Why would I go through that and hurt myself and be disappointed? No, I'll just stick to what worked for me in childhood, that I'll do it all myself. And there will have a lack of self-awareness, that they mightn't even be able to identify how troublesome this is, how damaging this is to themselves in adulthood. And this is where we talk about all these defenses. These worked well for you in childhood, but they can be detrimental to you in adulthood.
Right, absolutely. Is there ever an instance where, because the parent with this disorder views their child as an extension of themselves? Let's say that child does exactly what the parent wants, and from the parent's point of view, they're really thriving with the exact kind of formula that the parent wanted for them. Are they still going to find things to be disappointed by or criticize, or is there a situation where the child is thriving and the parent is thriving because they're doing exactly what the parent wants?
So the child will definitely not be thriving if they are doing what the parent wants, because they are only doing it for the parent's needs.
Right.
It's a bit like, some parents really want you to be a doctor, right? And they might really push that, and they might be really like, oh, you've got to be a doctor, you've got to go. And so the child goes on and they do that and they become the doctor, and they sort of think it's their choice, but actually they've been conditioned. It's called operant conditioning, and throughout their entire, from the moment they were born, or even conceived almost, that it's been decided for them that they will be a doctor. And then maybe one day kind of wake up and go, geez, I didn't ever want to be a doctor. Why am I doing this? And realize that, actually it's all this kind of history. And so the child in that is not thriving at all. And we would call that a midlife crisis, because it does tend to happen around sort of the age 40, where some people start reflecting because they become really kind of aware of their mortality for whatever reason. And then they go, actually, I want to change everything. So the parent might be happy, but it depends on the child's role. So we've got golden child, scapegoat child, we've got invisible child, and the gilded child. Now, the parent might be thriving with the idea that their child is doing everything that they want them to do. Whether or not they're a golden or a gilded child actually is going to come at the point of when they say, no to the parent. It's going to reveal itself then, because gilded children look very much like golden children. The golden children can get away with absolutely everything. They're like Teflon, everything kind of slides off them. They're never responsible for anything, and they're the favorite of the family. Everyone thinks that the parent thinks the sun shines out of you know where, and and they don't. They're not perfect, but the parent thinks that they are, and so treats them accordingly. And even when they make mistakes, it's blamed on external things. It's not the child's fault. They're exempt from responsibility at all times. Whereas the gilded child looks like the golden child, but actually what they are is a force field, a shield for the parent, and they're their protector and the voice. And then what happens is they become, they think that they are this protective force, but actually they're very enmeshed. And that's what we would call the emotional incest that we see. And then what will happen is at some point, if the gilded child turns around and says no, then they get punished. And what the golden sheen rubs away and they become wooden. We expose the wood, and actually what we then see is that they're actually a puppet, that they were just being exploited. So if a child is only doing things for parents because the parent wants them to be the doctor or the whatever it is, that's the parent might be happy, and that therefore might protect the child from attack. But if they are not meeting their own needs, their own autonomy, they're not thriving in any way, shape or form. And at some point that is going to collapse, and it will be fairly catastrophic too.
Could we put these 4 different types of kids in a situation? Maybe let's just say that there's a parent that has each type or something, some kind of example of how the parent would respond to each of them, maybe around a life event or a holiday or something like that.
Absolutely. So the golden child, as Helen said, that they will just be golden. So they can do no wrong. So whatever they're doing, it's absolutely wonderful. Yeah. You're talking about a life event. Let's even bring it back down smaller to the adult children coming home. So the golden child, if they just come home once a month, oh my God, it'll be wonderful. They made the effort. They come home. Aren't they just super? It was great to see them. They were so busy. They went out of their way, right? So they're praised. They're lauded. And this will even highlight why in families brought up in this dynamic, that it's so hard for the siblings to get on because they're pitted against each other. So what would happen then, the gilded child, so the child that thinks they're golden, there will be such an expectation put on them to meet the needs of the parent. So they will typically have visited way more often, but that isn't even noticed. It's not praised, and it's just expected. Well, of course you do that. And if you don't, there will be criticism and derision and name and shame put on that child. So, and when I say child, I'm talking about the adult child. So even in that situation, the gilded child could say, well, you know, I visited you 10 times and they only visit you once. Oh, this is typical of you. You know, you've always been jealous of them. You know, you can just, you know, you can't let sleeping dogs lie. You're like a dog with a bone. Why can't you just get over it? You know, they're very busy. That kind of God love them and let's praise them. So obviously there will be resentment building for the other children with the golden child. But that will be typically put on to the golden child and not actually directed where the healthy anger should be directed, towards the parent for actually pitting them against each other. The ignored child, they will just be that. They will be ignored. It won't be noticed whether they come home or not, which even as I'm saying that is deeply saddening. They all obviously are. There's catastrophic impacts on all of them, but they will just be ignored. It won't be noticed whether they're there or not. They will be invisible. You know, the ignored child is the invisible child. And then in this situation, the scapegoat will be blamed just for absolutely everything, no matter what goes wrong. They will be blamed whether this was a good outcome or a bad outcome. Even if they don't turn up, they will be blamed. So all the narcissistic parents' anger, rage, self-hatred will be projected on to the scapegoat child. They can do no right, ever. They're blamed for everything. They're like the sacrificial lamb that all the for want of a better word, sins of the family or sins of the parent will be cast upon that child. And they are typically the ones then that are this truth speaker, the ones that call out the dysfunction, and then the ones that break free from this toxic dynamic.
Wow, so interesting. Helen, anything to add on to that, by the way?
No, not really. Well, I wondered if you wanted to know where the term scapegoat comes from, because I think it represents.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the term scapegoat is a biblical term, and it was the idea that, wait, was it biblical, Katie, or was it Greek? I've now just gaslighting myself about it.
Now that you say that on the spot, I can't think.
Okay. Either way,
We'll
me
Google
use
it
it
later.
Yeah. But it basically, it's this term that was used to describe what used to happen would be that the town would, or the village would gather, and all the sins of the village would be placed upon the goat that was then sent into the wilderness to die. So it carried all the sins and the bad whatever into the wilderness and took it with them. So it carried all the badness of the whole system, right? So it's the placeholder for all the dysfunction, all the hatred, all the awfulness. And that's exactly what it is in the narcissistic family system. It's such an appropriate term for the scapegoat experience, because you are literally blamed for everything when it goes wrong.
And how does a parent with a disorder like this decide which kid is going to be what category? Are they even cognizant of something like that?
Well, so this is actually really dependent on birth order and which parent is the narcissistic parent. So when we've got a narcissistic mother, typically, and this is, I just want to make this really clear, it's not the same for everyone. And if you are not this birth order and this is not your experience, it doesn't mean that you are misidentifying or yourself or anything else your experience. But typically what we see when there's a narcissistic mother, it is the oldest girl who is the scapegoat child, because they are the first to disappoint the mother, because obviously she projects her whole identity onto this child. The child then is the first one who, the daughter is the first one who reaches for the autonomy, rejects mum's projected image, and then is therefore punished for it ever since. And the other children that follow her watch this, learn from it, and learn not to do that. So typically, oldest boy is then golden child, because of the patriarchy, and having boys somehow makes you a better woman in lots of social settings, but there we are. And then youngest child tends to be invisible. Again, not always the way. Those roles also can be fluid, so they don't always stay rigid. Sometimes they are rigid for the entire lifetime. Sometimes they're kind of long-term rigid, so 10, 20, 30 years even in the same role, and then something will happen and you might switch out roles and then you might switch back. They're almost daily fluid. So it really is very, dependent on the family system. For an only child, and just to kind of acknowledge that experience, they will cycle typically through all the roles so quickly it'll give them whiplash. They'll never have stability in or security in what role they're in at any given time. When it comes to narcissistic fathers, it's less predictable. But again, typically we'll see the oldest girl being golden, or the oldest boy, and then it's much harder to predict, but youngest boy being scapegoat. But again, super hard to predict with men. It just really depends on their own conditioning. It's a lot harder. But with women, definitely more often we'll see scapegoats are oldest girls, because they're first to disappoint.
Wow. I mean, I feel like, a lot of people have this concept of abuse, right? Where if it's not somebody physically harming somebody or telling them they're worthless or calling them the worst things on the planet, then anything that's not that isn't considered abuse. But we know that these things are so psychologically damaging in so many ways. Can you speak to that a little bit, of like, somebody's getting the silent treatment or they're getting manipulated or gaslit or anything? Are these things damaging, and if so, how?
Absolutely. And I just want to stay on that point that you're talking about, that a lot of people don't recognize and don't know what abuse is.
Right.
And they minimize it and dismiss emotional abuse because it's compared to sexual abuse or physical abuse. Whereas emotional abuse is the cornerstone of all abuse. No other abuse can exist without it. And so the one there that you mentioned, giving the child the silent treatment or stonewalling them, it's psychologically damaging to the child. It's emotionally abandoning the child, and it's conditioning the child to meet the needs of the parent. So obviously, when we think of a child is helpless. They're powerless. They need their parent or caregiver in order to survive. So it's simply put, their survival depends on it. And so now, if that parent withdraws their love and affection, if they go cold on them, or, non-nurturing, not loving, punishing them for something that they did, the child will quickly learn and adapt to recognize the parent's cues, right? They'll become hypervigilant. So they'll be able to recognize the difference between a look of disgust or a look of pride, the key in the door, what sort of mood the parent is. They'll be able to tell even from body language, even a sigh. When the parent sighs, the child will be able to pick up on those cues because they will know what's to come. And what the child will try to do is prevent that. They will try to, again, fawn to whatever the parent's needs and abandon their own in the process. And what we see as well, that what happens is the child, because of their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until they're 25. So that's the bit where our rational part of the brain, where we problem solve, where we're able to be able to future plan, that's not fully developed. So the child isn't able to rationalize what's happening. And also because of the moral defense, they will internalize what's happening. So they won't be able to decipher that, well, my parent is behaving bad, there's something wrong with my parent. They will internalize that and think that there's something wrong with me. There's something fundamentally flawed with me. And because we will typically see in these dynamics, if there's not another narcissistic parent, there will be what is an enabling parent. So when the parent is treating the child unfairly, the enabling parent will say, oh, well, you know what they're like. You know what they're like. So just apologize, just make amends, just keep the peace. And so again, the child is seeing that there's nobody standing up for them, that actually what we have to do is excuse their behavior is justified, and it's up to the child to make amends then in the situation. But in answer to your question, how damaging in this, it is psychologically damaging. It puts the child in a survival response, in their fight or flight, which is their fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And typically a child in that situation will fawn to the parent. And what happens when somebody grows up in an environment like this is that they stay stuck in one of those survival responses because this is ever present. And they're unable to toggle out from that. So what we typically hear somebody say is, well, I'm just the people pleaser. That's just who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Or they will often describe themselves as empaths. Oh, well, I'm just an empath. That's the way I was born. And what both Helen and I say is there's no such thing as an empath. What you are is a victim of abuse. And that can be so hard for somebody to hear. And if any of your listeners are hearing that now saying, no, I am. I can feel other people's emotions as if they're mine. And it's, no, you were conditioned to do that. You were conditioned to have this response and you weren't allowed to form your own identity. And that can be a devastating reality for somebody to expect. And yes, we absolutely hear people coming in saying, well, I had a good childhood, or I had a great childhood, or my parents are wonderful. And just one final thing to add from that, we just had a very recent episode, Helen, I think it was episode 130, an interview with somebody where they're saying, actually, mine didn't look like abuse at all. I was told that I was loved. I was told that they were so proud of me. And actually through that, what we can see is the engulfing parent, that they didn't have any space or room to breathe. So yes, a lot of people find this very, very difficult to identify.
Wow. Okay, so with the enabling parent and the narcissistic parent, again, you're kind of told your needs don't really matter. Just do what you got to do to please this person. I would imagine if, let's say, somebody had two narcissistic parents or multiple parents with the same kind of disorder, that would probably mean that when they do become independent in some way, they're drawn to friendships and relationships with those traits. So it's just everywhere, all the parents, the friendships, the romantic partnerships. How does someone even begin to question these things if it's all they've ever known, it's all they're drawn to? How does somebody get out of that? There's that concept of, asking a fish how they feel about water, and the fish says, what's water, right? Because they're born into it, right? They don't know there's air above there. So how could somebody even begin to unravel that for themselves?
That analogy of the fish and the water is amazing, because that is exactly what it is. But when you say to the fish, here's, how's the water? And they go, what water? And it's like, that thing that you're swimming around in, and you make them aware, and it's wet, and it's this, and it's that, and this is what it looks like. And So typically what will happen is there will be a catalytic event. So something like a wedding, the birth of a child, graduation, in an event that's meant to be around the person, the individual themselves. And somehow it becomes all about the parent, right? And they suddenly are like, hang on a minute, what's going on? Now that's got to happen before. There's got to be an awakening of self somewhere, just in a kind of, even just I just don't like the way they treat me, or why do they never apologize? Or there will be a kind of tip of the iceberg thing, and then it kind of all unravels because someone will start doing the research. That bit is so personal and it's so individual. And I really do believe this is a thing that you can only come to when you're ready to, that you are so heavily defended against seeing that. I mean, one of the signs of a heavily disorganized attachment style is idealizing childhood. Someone who has experienced huge amounts of trauma will talk about their perfect childhood. We actually see that in serial killers quite a lot, that they will talk, and they've inevitably and invariably experienced a huge amount of childhood trauma, but they will what's called fairy tale, and they will talk about how wonderful their childhood was. And we see that absolutely as evidence of very disorganized attachment. Because if you've got a healthy attachment, you're going to go, oh yeah, no, my parents are great. I mean, my mum can nag a bit and my dad can do that, and when whatever they're able to be critical without punishment, without hate or distaste. They can be safe to say my parent is a flawed human being without fear of that rupturing their relationship. Whereas in a disorganized attachment style, they will go into this big fairy tailing of kind of how amazing their parents, their best friend, and all this. So what they're actually demonstrating there is actually enmeshment, perhaps, or even just idealization and the fantasy bond to the abusive parent too. So you've got so many coping mechanisms and systems protecting the child and adult child from seeing their parent as abusive. So to crack through all of that is quite hard, even when they're in therapy. And you have to do it as a therapist. If someone's not aware, very carefully, very gently, you just have to do it. So, because otherwise you just spark all the defense mechanisms. But when somebody does eventually realize, the thing that they have to do is educate themselves, absolutely learn and consume as much researched information as possible. There's a lot of misinformation, of course, too. And if you can access therapy, support groups, anywhere that you're going to be held accountable for your own behavior, because you will have learned behaviors that are difficult, that might be toxic too, and you will have to undo them and take responsibility for them, which is a hard truth to face, because not only have you survived all this abuse, then you learn that on top of that, oh, I've got a couple of things that maybe aren't very healthy in relationship too. And you asked at the very beginning about personality disorders, and I said to you about trauma causing them. Yeah. Nearly everyone that I've come across with borderline personality disorder, or EUPD, has had a narcissistic parent. One of the biggest signs to me that someone has got an abusive parent is borderline personality disorder. So, yeah, it's a lot of untangling and a lot of work to undo it. And anybody listening to this going, so bloody unfair, you're right, it is unfair. And I just want to validate it so much. It's not your fault that this happened to you. Unfortunately, it is your responsibility to make sure that you stop it with you and don't pass it on to other people, to give yourself the best chance of having healthy relationships. But if you choose to have children, them to have healthy relationships, both with you and then others as they move through life too.
Wow. I mean, yeah, if somebody is aware that their parent is abusive and then they have kids and they do not want to do that to their kids, but then they develop BPD, borderline, that's just such a sad cycle that now it's up to them to break that, even though they were the ones abused as well. And that's what their coping mechanism was. What did you say that borderline is now called?
EUPD and
emotionally unstable personality disorder.
Emotionally unstable.
Okay.
And there's another one of it as well, emotional dysregulation disorder or something, EDD. So there was just this try and shift away from the stigma, because there's a huge stigma around BPD,
Right.
especially therapists working with it, that it's challenging work. There's no lie about that. But my experience of borderline is that when people come into therapy, they generally, and occasionally this is not true, but this is not true of many people. They don't have to have BPD. They just, generally, when people come into therapy, they want to do the work. If they're only there for validation, they will be leaving fairly shortly, because that's not going to happen. They get challenged. And actually, some people found that really helpful that I worked with, because the idea of being borderline, feeling like that means they're not quite a person. Borderline personality disorder. I'm not quite a person because I'm borderline. I'm on the edge of humanity. And I mean, that's a bloody horrible way to kind of view things, right? And a human being who's been traumatized, and then we're further traumatizing by excluding them from society because, oh, you've had all that trauma and you've developed all these coping mechanisms, so we'll just put you over there, thanks. And then a lot of therapists are like, no, you're too complex, can't work with you. I mean, that's appropriate in some respects, because you've got to have the skill to do so. But also, can you imagine how hurtful that is when one of the biggest issues that people with BPD, UPD struggle with is rejection? And so then they reach out for help, and, oh no, I can't help you, you're too much. I mean, that's horrendous and just confirms
Devastating.
all sorts of narratives,
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this concept of fairy tailing your childhood. Now, the person that's doing that, are they even are they aware that they're doing that often, or is it something that they're really not aware? They really think they had this idyllic childhood, or are they just scared of potential criticism if that parent were to find out that they said anything? Like, I've never heard this concept before.
It can be both.
Okay.
So we talk about, the fear, obligation, and guilt. So fear if I speak out against my parent. But in the narcissistic family system, it's akin to a cult where you're brainwashed, where you're conditioned to be in a role, where you're conditioned to think a certain way, where you're conditioned to think that my family is superior and better than. Even though if I am not good enough to be part of my family, I'm less than. I'm so lucky to be in this family because we are better. We are so good. And the conditioning, one of the ways that they do that is through parentification. So there's 3 different types of parentification: emotional, instrumental, and narcissistic. And emotional parentification is where the parent treats their child as their mini therapist, as their confidant, as their best friend, as their substitute spouse. So when they're not getting their needs met, when the parent is not getting their needs met by the other partner, they're treating their child as that intimate partner, and boundaries are really blurred. And the child can feel so special in that my mother and father need me so much. The child will think that they're indispensable, whereas what they're not realizing is that they're exploited. What they're not seeing is that the parent actually has other options to go to talk about, let's say, what's going on in their relationship, because one of the things they'll confide in their children is stuff about their sexual relationship, stuff about their arguments, stuff about money, making the child feel responsible, whereas the child doesn't have power. Whereas the parent could actually go and talk to somebody. And even if they can't, because there's a privilege to go to therapy, if that's not a therapist, there's helplines, there's family members, there's, for people that are involved in their church that they can go and share with. But if they do that, the adult will be treated as an adult and will have to take accountability in their relationship. So they're manipulating the child here, and the child won't realize that as a young child. What we also see is instrumental parentification. And so this is where the child will be just treated like a young adult. So they will have to, let's say, hand up keep or bring money into the house. They will have to tend to the younger siblings and be a parent to their siblings. So let's say getting the other kids out to school in the morning, making dinners, tending to somebody that is elderly or unwell within the home. Again, the child having this responsibility placed on them. Helen talked about there with the expectations, if you have a child and want them to be a doctor. This is where we see in the instrumental parentification, if there's any business within the family, be that a farm or any sort of business, that the children are sent to work so early and their labor is exploited. And then we have narcissistic parentification, which will be and which you will see instrumental and emotional parentification, but you will also see what we've talked about throughout this whole podcast, a whole identity projected onto the child and a denial of the child's own autonomy, a denial of their childhood, a denial of their freedom, a denial of their expression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How might a child be treated in maybe a divorce setting with a narcissistic parent and somebody who isn't narcissistic? What might that look like for people?
Oh, this is so difficult, because this is where parental alienation might start happening, because the narcissistic parent might run a smear campaign against the other parent. You know, children essentially become pawns, and the narcissistic parent, if they are the one that is rejecting, might just leave and move on and abandon the children. And whilst that's dreadful and awful, maybe it's actually for the better as well, in some respects, because the child isn't then being exposed to that kind of level of abuse all the time.
Yeah.
However, if the narcissistic parent is the one being rejected, then children become weapons, because the worst thing we can do to a narcissist is reject them, because what they will then do is absolutely smear campaign, have their vengeance. You provoke something called narcissistic rage, and that any time that we are essentially criticizing them, making them question their superiority, making them feel inferior in any way, that needs revenge, that needs vengeance. So in that circumstance, the children become weapons that they will fight for and do it just to punish the other parent, which is why when it comes to leaving a narcissist, we use something called grey rock method in order to get them to discard us, so that we are as protected as possible from that smear campaign. It's their idea, and we just kind of go along with it, as it were. And people really struggle with it because it feels like you're manipulating them back. And I get that, why it feels, because you are in a way, but actually the thing about it is you're not talking with someone who's rational. You're never going to explain to them it's better for the child if we do XYZ, if we're collaborative. You're only ever going to be able to parallel parent with that narcissist. You're never going to be able to co-parent. And if that means that you have to be really mindful about how you interact with them and allow them to think that they've kind of won points against you so that you are protected and your child is protected, then so be it. That doesn't mean you are manipulative. It means you are protecting your child and yourself, which is your job as the protector. So when there's a divorce, it can be very difficult for basically everyone involved, especially when the narcissist feels that they have been slighted or made to look bad in some way. And then the smear campaigns go off in a big way. It's really difficult.
What is an example of a smear campaign that a child might hear about the parent that isn't narcissistic? What would that look like, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
A smear campaign is just a full-on character assassination. So it can be anything from them being, and by the way, this does not differentiate between the parent or if a smear campaign is against the child. So just that they're the worst person in the world, that they're crazy, that they're delusional, that they're unstable, that they're selfish, that they're cold-hearted, that they're mean, that they're lazy, that they're so self-centered. Really, when we think of the narcissist, we think that projection is confession. So really all the things that we could say right back to them. So anything that attacks the character of that person. And it's really, really damaging. And what's really devastating for the victim of a smear campaign is not only the person that was supposed to love and care for them saying that, it can also then be the extended family or the people that believe the smear campaign against the person, because the realization that actually, these people don't know me. I thought these other people cared about me as well, but actually they're not even coming asking my side of the story. They're not coming to see if I'm okay. They're believing, colluding with this narrative. And this is where we see the systems of the dysfunction set up, that it isn't just narrowed to the narcissistic parent, because as Helen said right back at the beginning, they have grown up in their own trauma. So what we will see is dysfunction in that extended family. So we'll see flying monkeys. So people doing the narcissist bidding and coming and, asking you to re-engage with that parent. So the smear campaign can be anything that they can be used against the person, and just a complete annihilation, a character assassination. And I just want to ask Helen there, does she have anything to add to that?
You know, the thing about the smear campaign is there's no holds barred. So total mistruths. The stories I've heard are this was actually a mother against their own child, the child had gone no contact, had been no contact for about 5 years, I think it was, and had moved away. So mum didn't even know where they were living, but somehow managed to find out. And whilst this adult child was out, and at this point she had 2 children of her own that were small, they were toddler age, you know, really quite little, like 1 and 3 or so. Whilst the adult child was out, mum snuck into the house, planted drugs.
Oh my God.
Left, called the police, who also called the CPS, who did a search, took the children. Now, it was sorted very quickly, but that still was... So basically the grandmother, the narcissistic mother, was trying to get custody of the children that she had never even met. She didn't know them. So see the level of entitlement, the level of exploitation, the level of superiority. I'll get away with this. I'll manage this. And I'm better to raise those children than my daughter is, right? And the narcissistic mother did end up going to prison in the end for it. But the reality of that is that those children were then traumatized, as was the mother of the children, because they were taken away for 72 hours and put in protective custody. And, you know, whilst they were investigating it. Now, what on earth? What on earth? And that is like a smear campaign in action, is that they will post things on Facebook, they'll post things on any kind of social media, make up stories that are absolutely foundless, or even worse, 1 grain of truth. And so that person is, well, no, that bit's true, but the rest of it's, well, yeah, but if that's true, then maybe you're not telling the truth, you know, blah, blah. Oh my God. So smear campaigns are absolutely devastating to people.
And they could be so incredibly dangerous, because it's not like I think people think of, a smear campaign, you shouldn't be upset, they're just saying that you looked ugly in that dress or something. But no, they could actually be taking steps to completely ruin your life.
They will phone your work, they will report you for drugs, they will tell people such lies like, well, yeah, no, she's always had mental health and it's just more evidence of mental health. And there'll be this, basically a painting of a person that is totally, and I don't really like using this word, but crazy and unstable, irrational, making poor choices. And it's all about that person's mental stability than it is about any other kind of responsibility or dynamic going on. And so if you are hearing somebody talk about someone else in a way that's making them sound absolutely psychotically unstable, use critical thinking. Ask yourself, what does this person stand to gain for me to believe this story? Are they speaking about their own child? Are they acknowledging any of their own responsibility in that? Because if my child was mentally struggling and mentally ill to that level, having psychotic breaks, I'm not posting it on social media, and I'm not shaming them by talking about it to other people. What I am doing is getting them what help I can, whilst also keeping myself and my other child safe. I am being supportive with boundaries, but I'm not telling everyone in the world in order to paint myself in a better light, even if they are doing the opposite, right? Even if they are standing there going, my mum's this, that, and the other, I'm not going to stand up and defend myself if they're mentally unwell, because I'm a parent. That's my job, right? To protect them. And what I would be doing is getting social services, whoever involved, to make sure that they got support, whatever that cost my reputation, because my priority is my child's well-being.
And just to go back, what you had mentioned there, you know, how devastating this is. And if people are listening and they're going, oh, well, my parent never did that, you know, so therefore it's not that bad. What they're doing is, you know, internally gaslighting themselves. When we look at this and not in comparative trauma, but, kind of on the smaller end of the scale with the smear campaign, because ultimately all these behaviors are all about dominance and control. And in order to do that, they want to isolate the child. So anybody that has held boundaries or said no against a narcissistic parent, or reduced, limited contact, or gone no contact, even the audacity of the parent to turn around and say, well, I don't know why they did that. I don't know anything about that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because even in that, what they're implying and inferring is that there's something, again, wrong with their child, that they are being overly sensitive or dramatic, or, typically the parent can even be dismissive. Oh, they're talking about something that I did in childhood. So they're either directly saying or implying that it's ridiculous. And in doing that, what they're trying to do is drive a wedge again between these relationships. And when we think again, right back to the beginning of community, and that we are designed to be part of a community, to isolate somebody and turn everybody against them is so damaging. Whereas exactly what Helen said, if your child was struggling, what you want is those supports around your child. What you want people to do is be offering them the compassion, the empathy, whatever they need. And this again is showing the intent. This is showing how dangerous it is, that ultimately what they want to do is damage and isolate their child for their dominance and control.
I was listening to one of your podcasts, or a couple of your podcast episodes, and there seems to maybe be a theme where if the narcissistic parent doesn't get information first, or if they feel like they're excluded from information, the entitlement to somebody's, private stuff, right? What's going on with that? Anything that you want to share around something like that?
That is all about superiority, and its information is currency, right? So if they have the knowledge, they control and dominate everything. You think knowledge is power. Did you ever watch Game of Thrones?
I did. Several episodes. Yeah.
Katie, have you watched it?
No.
No, I knew it. I always go, look at this cultural reference. And Katie's like, I've not seen it.
But you two did. So I understand what you're talking about, the superiority and entitlement.
Look at any kind of historical drama. There's always someone in the background who's the secret keeper, who's got the knowledge. Thomas Cromwell at Henry VIII was the one who was like the puppet master, because the person who has all the knowledge, has all the secrets, knows this, that, and the other. They know how they can weaponize it, first of all. They know how they can use things to their advantage. They've got like bird's eye view over everything and all the relationships. So if I go out for a drink with Katie and the narcissist is like, why didn't I know you were doing that? They will be nervous that Katie and I are forming a relationship outside of their control, which is when triangulation starts coming into play. So, Katie, don't tell Helen, but do you know she was saying some really mean things about you the other day. She was really annoyed with you because you took her last biscuit. But don't say I said anything. I just thought you should know, right? So immediately, Katie's like, oh, Helen's annoyed with me and she didn't come and tell me, but maybe I can't raise that. And then Katie kind of goes, well, oh, if I tell Helen I know, then I've betrayed that person. Now, Katie subconsciously or consciously is going to be aware that that person is a threat. Just because of their behavior, our amygdala picks up signs that we maybe can't process and make sense of in our prefrontal cortex. So at some level, Katie's going to be aware that there's a threat from this person. So if she tells me that she knows this information, it means that she's basically throwing that person under the bus, and she might get then punished. But what it does then is drive a little wedge. And I notice she's off with me. I'm like, hey, why have you been off with me? No, I'm not. No, everything's fine. But I know she is. So that makes me a bit paranoid. Why is Katie being weird with me? Why wouldn't she talk to me about it? What's going on? And so that then drives a wedge. But when it comes to the narcissistic parent, wanting all that information first, it is just about that. Controlling relationships, controlling the flow of information, controlling who is close to who and who she can or he can exploit for whatever thing that they want, but also to stop their own behavior being exposed. Because the reason children in narcissistic families are pitted against each other is to stop them bonding and talking about the behavior that's being exhibited towards them, which therefore would expose the behavior, which would then unite the children and remove the narcissistic parent's power, right? It's all about power and control, all of it.
Wow.
Because that is what they want, because it reinforces the sense of superiority and so forth. All behavior is rooted in reinforcing the idea that they are superior to everyone else. that grandiosity trait. So every other behavior that they use is about reinforcing that idea in that space.
Interesting. So it's like, maybe they know more than other people, or maybe they've manipulated somebody to tell them more information, whatever it is. They can maybe even use
Definitely.
that, like, oh, I'm more important than this person because I knew this and you didn't, or didn't you know that, that, okay. Very interesting. So let's say that somebody is really resonating with this and they want to start putting up some boundaries with their narcissistic parent, whether that is low contact or no contact or anything like that. What are some first steps somebody could take, and how could they be helped with this decision?
Helen has mentioned earlier, awareness. So educating yourself on this topic. And we have loads of resources on our website, insidepodcast.com, free resources and paid resources. So you can educate yourself on that. But one of the ways somebody can do this is, and Helen mentioned it earlier, is the grey rock method. And when just on the back of what you are talking about information being like currency to the narcissistic parent, this is like putting them on an information diet. So this is not sharing anything with the parent that they can use with anybody else, so really used for their own gain. So, and essentially it is just being boring as a rock. Now, that doesn't mean that you are being short or rude or snappy in any way. So what that might sound like is the narcissistic parent saying, oh, where were you this weekend, or what did you get up to? Oh, nothing much. What about you? Yeah. And you're turning it back to them, which is their favorite topic to talk about anyway. So if they're saying, oh, you weren't around to see me. No. Yeah. And then, oh, you were too busy for me. Oh, I was just kept going. What did you get up to? So you're not feeding in. See the way they're baiting you and trying to provoke and elicit a reaction because they're looking for supply. So you're not giving them their supply. You're protecting your own peace. And again, to get this far, there has to be a huge level of awareness and to be able to recognize what's happening and how you're being provoked and being made to be reactive in those moments.
Yeah.
Katie, Helen, thank you so much for your time today. I feel like I need to have you back for many more episodes because we barely scratched the surface. But is there anything that you want to leave people with? And then, of course, where can people find you and all of your work, all that good stuff?
What I would like to leave people with personally is empathy and compassion. If you're hearing your experience in this episode, that can be really disconcerting, and just to really hold you in that and recognize that for you. We, on our website, which is insightpodcast.com, have tons of resources, blogs. All our podcast episodes are up there. Our Patreon links are up there, but also links to our Facebook group, which is an amazing supportive community. There's like a real communal knowledge in that space where people are both sharing and supportive too of what they know, what they've experienced, but also are held accountable in their own behavior too. So it's a very safe space because we are on it like hotcakes. Go to insightpodcast.com. You can find links to our book, everything else, and then be kind to yourself. You deserve your own compassion, and there is absolutely hope and healing and healthy relationships out there. So you just have to choose to take it.
I have nothing to add there. I just want to second everything Helen said.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
That's been fab. It's been so fun.
All right, everyone, go check out all the amazing resources that Katie and Helen have to offer, including their podcast, which is a really cool format where people often write in with their questions and stories. And then Katie and Helen help them break things down and offer insights on their situation and all that good stuff. And then stay tuned for more episode topics that you voted on. There were 3 topics total that were extremely close in the voting process. One was off by like 1 vote. So I'm just considering the top 3 as the winners, and I'd like to cover them all for you. So there are 2 more topics coming up as part of the most recent Helpster's Choice submissions and voting Patreon reward. Hope you all have a great rest of your day or evening, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for tuning in to Self-Helpless. You can find our brand new merch, Patreon community, and other fun goodies at selfhelplesspodcast.com. We'd be thrilled if you left an Apple Podcast review, shared this episode with a friend, or post about it on Instagram and tag us at Self-Helpless Podcast so we could repost you and say hi. As an independently produced show, we sincerely appreciate your support. Thanks, everybody.